On a frigid December morning in the year 2000, in a small Idaho town where everyone knew their neighbors and doors were rarely locked, a young woman vanished without a trace. Her name was Jennifer Hayes, 23 years old, a part-time waitress at the local diner, and a devoted mother to her 4-year-old daughter, Emma. She was last seen alive leaving her shift at approximately 11:30 on the evening of December 14th. By dawn, her car had been found abandoned on a dirt road 3 miles outside town, engine cold, keys still in the ignition, her purse sitting untouched on the passenger seat. But Jennifer was gone, and for nearly 25 years, the question that haunted this community remained unanswered. What happened to Jennifer Hayes on that bitter winter night, and who was responsible for her disappearance? The town of Clearwater, Idaho, population approximately 2,300 residents, sits nestled in the northern panhandle of the state, surrounded by dense pine forests and rolling foothills that stretch toward the Canadian border. In the year 2000, it was the kind of place where Friday night football games brought out the entire town, where the coffee shop on Main Street knew your order before you walked through the door, where generations of families had built their lives on logging, small farming, and the modest tourism that came with the nearby lake. The winters were harsh, with temperatures regularly dropping below freezing and snow accumulating in thick drifts that turned the landscape into an endless expanse of white silence. Jennifer Marie Hayes had lived in Clearwater her entire life. Born on April 7, 1977, she had graduated from Clearwater High School in 1995, where she had been known as a quiet but friendly presence, someone who worked hard in her classes and kept to herself outside of a small circle of friends. After graduation, she had taken a job at Miller's Diner, the only 24-hour restaurant in town, working the evening and overnight shifts that most people avoided. The pay was modest, barely above minimum wage, but the tips were decent enough, and Jennifer needed every dollar she could earn. She lived with her daughter Emma in a small rental house on Birch Street, a modest single-story structure with peeling white paint and a chain-link fence that enclosed a tiny front yard. The house belonged to Harold Vickers, an elderly man who owned several properties around town and was known for being lenient with rent when times were tough. Jennifer's mother, Patricia Hayes, lived 20 minutes away in the neighboring town of Pine Ridge, and she watched Emma during Jennifer's evening shifts, a routine that had been established since Emma was an infant. December 14th, 2000 began like any other winter day in Clearwater. The temperature at dawn was 19 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light dusting of fresh snow covering the streets and sidewalks. Jennifer had spent the early afternoon at her mother's house, dropping Emma off around 3 o'clock before heading home to rest before her shift. Those who knew her said she seemed in good spirits that day, perhaps a bit tired, but nothing seemed amiss. She had mentioned to her mother that she was looking forward to Christmas, just 11 days away, and that she had already hidden Emma's presents in the closet, wrapped in bright red paper with silver bows. At 7:45 that evening, Jennifer arrived at Miller's Diner for the start of her shift. The diner sat on the corner of Main Street and Highway 21, a squat brick building with large windows that glowed warm and inviting against the dark winter night. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and grilled onions, and the jukebox in the corner played a steady rotation of country music and classic rock. Jennifer clocked in at exactly 7:51, according to the time card that would later be examined by investigators. She tied her apron around her waist, poured herself a cup of coffee, and began her routine. The evening shift was relatively quiet. A few regulars came in for dinner, some truckers stopped for pie and coffee, and a group of teenagers occupied a booth near the back, laughing and sharing a plate of French fries. Jennifer worked alongside 2 other waitresses, Linda Kowalski and Brenda Tate, both women in their 40s who had known Jennifer since she was a child. They would later tell investigators that Jennifer seemed normal that night, perhaps a bit distracted, but not unusually so. She had mentioned that her car was making a strange noise when she started it, a rattling sound that worried her, but she couldn't afford to take it to the mechanic until after the holidays. At approximately 11:15, Jennifer finished her shift. The diner manager, Tom Barrett, a balding man in his mid-50s with a perpetually tired expression, watched her untie her apron and grab her coat from the hook by the kitchen. She had earned $73 in tips that night, money she carefully folded and placed in her jeans pocket. She said goodnight to Linda and Brenda, pushed open the glass door, and stepped out into the cold December night. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees. Fresh snow had begun to fall, light flakes that drifted down through the glow of the streetlights and settled on the windshields of parked cars. Jennifer's vehicle was a 1989 Chevrolet Cavalier, light blue with rust spots along the wheel wells and a crack across the top of the windshield. She had purchased it 3 years earlier for $800, and it had served her well despite its age and constant mechanical issues. Security footage from the hardware store across the street, footage that would be reviewed countless times in the coming weeks, showed Jennifer walking to her car at 11:28. She unlocked the driver's side door, climbed inside, and sat for approximately 2 minutes before starting the engine. Investigators would later speculate that she was letting the car warm up, or perhaps counting her tips, or simply gathering her thoughts before the short drive home. At 11:31, her taillights disappeared from the camera's view as she pulled onto Highway 21, heading south. It was the last confirmed sighting of Jennifer Hayes alive. The drive from Miller's Diner to Jennifer's house on Birch Street should have taken approximately 8 minutes. The route was straightforward, south on Highway 21 for 2 miles, then a left turn onto Birch, followed by 3 blocks to her house. But Jennifer never arrived home, and at 6:43 the following morning, December 15th, a dairy farmer named Robert Emerson discovered her car on Old Mill Road, a narrow dirt path that branched off the highway approximately 3 miles south of town, leading into dense forest used primarily by hunters and loggers. Robert had been driving to check on his cattle when he noticed the blue Cavalier parked at an odd angle, half on the road and half in the shallow ditch beside it. He slowed his truck, pulled alongside, and peered through the driver's side window. The car was empty. The keys dangled from the ignition. The engine was cold to the touch. Jennifer's purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside, $23 in cash still present. Her jacket, a heavy winter coat she had been wearing when she left the diner, lay crumpled in the back seat. But there was no sign of Jennifer. Robert immediately drove to the nearest house, a small cabin owned by Frank and Doris Mitchell, and used their phone to contact the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Carl Henderson arrived at the scene at 7:18. He approached the vehicle cautiously, noting immediately that nothing appeared disturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood visible on the seats or dashboard. The driver's side door was unlocked. When Deputy Henderson turned the key in the ignition, the engine turned over smoothly, despite having sat in the cold for hours. The gas tank was nearly full. The odometer reading would later confirm that the vehicle had traveled exactly 3.7 miles from the diner. By 8 o'clock, Sheriff Martin Cross had arrived at the scene, along with 3 additional deputies and a tracking dog borrowed from the state police. The temperature had risen to 21 degrees, but fresh snow continued to fall, covering any footprints or tire tracks that might have been present. The dog was given Jennifer's scent from the jacket found in the back seat, and it immediately began pulling toward the tree line, approximately 50 yards from where the car had been found. The handler followed, along with deputies carrying flashlights and calling Jennifer's name into the silent woods. The search continued throughout the day. Volunteers from Clearwater arrived by late morning, forming organized lines that swept through the forest in coordinated patterns. Patricia Hayes, Jennifer's mother, stood at the edge of the search area, her face pale and drawn, her hands clutching a photograph of her daughter. She had already been to Jennifer's house on Birch Street and had found it exactly as Jennifer had left it the previous afternoon. Doors locked, lights off. Emma's toys scattered across the living room floor. Emma was with a neighbor now, shielded from the growing fear that something terrible had happened to her mother. By nightfall on December 15th, more than 100 volunteers had combed through 12 square miles of forest. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Jennifer had ever walked into those woods. The tracking dog had lost the scent after approximately 100 yards, suggesting either that Jennifer had been transported by vehicle or that the falling snow had obscured her trail. Deputies began interviewing everyone who had been at Miller's diner the previous night, creating a list of names and alibis that would grow longer as the investigation progressed. They spoke with Linda and Brenda, who both insisted Jennifer had seemed fine when she left. They spoke with Tom Barrett, who confirmed the exact time Jennifer had clocked out. They spoke with the teenagers who had been sitting in the back booth, with the truckers who had stopped for coffee, with every person who might have seen Jennifer during her final hours. One detail emerged that seemed significant. A waitress named Brenda Tate mentioned that a man had come into the diner around 10:45, just 45 minutes before Jennifer finished her shift. He had sat at the counter, ordered a cup of coffee, and seemed to be watching Jennifer as she worked. Brenda described him as being in his early 30s, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. She remembered thinking it was odd because he barely touched his coffee and left abruptly after about 20 minutes, leaving exact change on the counter without waiting for his receipt. When shown the security footage, investigators could see the man Brenda described, but his face was obscured by the cap, and he had parked outside the camera's range. They never identified him, and he never came forward. As December turned to a cold and anxious Christmas, the investigation continued but with diminishing leads. Sheriff Cross held a press conference on December 20th, standing before a cluster of microphones and cameras from regional news stations, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the exhaustion of sleepless nights. He announced that Jennifer's disappearance was being treated as a possible abduction, that all available resources were being deployed, and that anyone with information should contact the department immediately. The reward fund for information leading to Jennifer's whereabouts had grown to $15,000, donated by community members and local businesses. But as the days passed with no breaks in the case, a different kind of investigation began to take shape. Deputies began looking more closely at the people in Jennifer's life, at relationships and histories that might reveal a motive or a suspect. They spoke with Jennifer's ex-boyfriend, Marcus Delray, who lived in Spokane and had an alibi confirmed by his employer. They spoke with her coworkers again, asking different questions now, probing for jealousies or conflicts that might have gone unmentioned. And they spoke extensively with Patricia Hayes, Jennifer's mother, asking about Jennifer's state of mind, her finances, her plans for the future. Patricia told them that Jennifer had been worried about money, that she was behind on rent and struggling to afford Christmas presents for Emma. She told them that Jennifer had seemed stressed in the weeks before her disappearance, but nothing more than the usual strain of being a single mother working long hours for low pay. She mentioned that Jennifer had been dating someone casually, a man named David Thornton who worked at the lumber mill outside town, but that the relationship was new and not serious. Deputies immediately sought out David Thornton, finding him at his small apartment on the east side of Clearwater. David Thornton was 28 years old, tall and broad-shouldered with sandy blonde hair and a quiet demeanor. He worked as a foreman at Clearwater Lumber Mill, a job he had held for 6 years, and he was known around town as reliable and hardworking. When deputies arrived at his door on December 22nd, he invited them in without hesitation. His apartment was tidy, sparsely furnished, with a television playing a basketball game on mute. He answered their questions calmly, confirming that yes, he had been seeing Jennifer for about 3 months, that he cared about her deeply, and that her disappearance had devastated him. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of December 14th, he provided his alibi without pause. He had been at home alone, watching television and doing laundry. He had no witnesses to confirm this, but he seemed genuinely distraught when speaking about Jennifer, his voice breaking as he asked if there was anything he could do to help. Deputies took note of his story but found nothing immediately suspicious. They searched his apartment with his permission, finding nothing unusual. They examined his vehicle, a 1994 Ford pickup truck, and found it clean, recently vacuumed. They asked him about his relationship with Jennifer, whether they had fought recently, whether there had been any jealousy or tension. David shook his head slowly, his hands clasped between his knees. He said they had been happy, that Jennifer had introduced him to Emma just 2 weeks earlier, and that he had been hoping they might have a future together. Deputies made note of everything but had no grounds to consider him a suspect. Not yet. Part 2. The investigation, the search for Jennifer Hayes, continued through the final days of December and into the new year. Teams of volunteers, supplemented by professionals from the Idaho State Police and a specialized search and rescue unit from Boise, expanded their efforts to cover a 30-mile radius around the location where Jennifer's car had been found. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the forest, hoping to detect any trace of a body or a person seeking shelter. Divers searched the cold waters of Clearwater Lake and the smaller ponds that dotted the surrounding landscape. Every abandoned building, every hunting cabin, every storage shed within 20 miles was checked and rechecked. The community response was overwhelming. Churches organized prayer vigils, attended by hundreds of people who stood in the cold, holding candles and singing hymns. Local businesses posted flyers with Jennifer's photograph in their windows, and radio stations broadcast regular updates about the search efforts. The high school gymnasium was transformed into a coordination center where volunteers could check in, receive assignments, and warm themselves with coffee and sandwiches donated by local restaurants. Patricia Hayes was there every day, her eyes red-rimmed from crying and lack of sleep, thanking each volunteer personally and begging them not to give up on her daughter. But as January progressed, the initial surge of hope began to fade into a grim determination shadowed by growing doubt. No physical evidence had been found despite the exhaustive searches. No witnesses had come forward with credible information about Jennifer's whereabouts after she left the diner. The mysterious man in the baseball cap had never been identified, and investigators were beginning to notice small inconsistencies and odd behaviors that didn't quite fit the narrative of a random abduction. The first inconsistency involved the timeline. Jennifer had left Miller's diner at 11:31, according to the security footage. The drive to her house should have taken 8 minutes, but her car had been found 3 miles south of town on Old Mill Road, a location that made no sense if she had been heading home. Deputies carefully measured the distance from the diner to the location of the car, then measured the distance from the diner to Jennifer's house. They calculated driving times and examined maps. Old Mill Road was not on the way to anywhere Jennifer would normally go. It was a dead-end road used primarily for accessing logging sites. Why would Jennifer have turned onto that road in the middle of the night? One theory was that she had been followed, that someone had forced her off the highway and onto the dirt road. But there were problems with this theory. Jennifer's car showed no signs of damage consistent with being run off the road. The positioning of the vehicle, half in the ditch, suggested it had been parked deliberately rather than crashed. And if Jennifer had been forced off the road by another vehicle, where were the tire tracks? The snow had fallen throughout the night, yes, but Robert Emerson had discovered the car only 7 hours after Jennifer's shift ended. Fresh tire tracks should have been visible. Another theory suggested Jennifer had pulled onto Old Mill Road voluntarily, perhaps meeting someone she knew. This theory gained traction when deputies learned more about David Thornton's movements on the night in question. While David had maintained he was home alone, watching television and doing laundry, investigators found no corroboration for this alibi. His neighbors couldn't confirm seeing his truck parked outside his apartment that evening. He had made no phone calls and received none. His cable television provider could confirm his service was active, but not whether he had actually been watching. For someone claiming to have spent a quiet evening at home, David had remarkably little evidence to support his story. Deputies returned to David's apartment on January 8th, this time with more pointed questions. They asked him to walk them through his evening again, step by step, noting the exact times of his activities. David repeated his story, but this time investigators noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. He became more defensive, crossing his arms over his chest and avoiding direct eye contact. When asked if Jennifer might have called him after leaving work, David hesitated before answering. He said she hadn't called, that he had expected to see her the following day. But when deputies examined phone records, they discovered something David hadn't mentioned. Jennifer had called his apartment phone at 11:41 on the night she disappeared. Clear's throat, the call had lasted 18 seconds. Too short for a real conversation, perhaps just long enough for a brief exchange or for leaving a voicemail. When confronted with this information, David's composure cracked slightly. He admitted that yes, Jennifer had called, but he hadn't answered because he had been in the shower. He said he had noticed the missed call later and had tried calling her back around midnight, but she hadn't answered. This was consistent with phone records, which showed an outgoing call from David's phone to Jennifer's at 12:03. But deputies wondered, why hadn't David mentioned this during his initial interviews? Why had he omitted this detail if it was innocent? Further investigation revealed more troubling information. Deputies learned from Linda Kowalski, Jennifer's coworker, that Jennifer had confided in her about some tension in her relationship with David. According to Linda, Jennifer had mentioned during a shift about 2 weeks before her disappearance that David had been acting possessive, wanting to know where she was at all times, calling her multiple times during her shifts at the diner. Jennifer had laughed it off at the time, saying David was just worried about her working late at night, but Linda remembered feeling uneasy about the conversation. She hadn't thought much of it until Jennifer disappeared. Deputies also spoke with Patricia Hayes again, asking specifically about David Thornton. Patricia admitted that she had only met David twice, and that Jennifer had seemed reluctant to bring him around more often. When pressed, Patricia revealed something she had initially forgotten. Jennifer had called her mother on December 13th, the day before she disappeared, and had mentioned that she was thinking about ending things with David. She had said he was getting too serious too quickly, that she wasn't ready for a committed relationship, and that she needed to focus on Emma. Patricia had advised her daughter to follow her heart and to be gentle when breaking the news. Had Jennifer told David she wanted to end the relationship? Had she arranged to meet him on Old Mill Road to have that conversation in private? These questions led investigators to scrutinize David Thornton more closely. They examined his background, searching for any history of violence or controlling behavior. They found nothing significant in his criminal record, just a speeding ticket from 3 years earlier and a minor citation for fishing without a license. Coworkers at the lumber mill described David as quiet and reserved, someone who kept to himself, but was generally friendly and competent at his job. His supervisor, Gerald Fletcher, said David had never missed a day of work except for a sick day taken on December 15th, the day after Jennifer disappeared. Deputies found this timing suspicious. Why had David taken a sick day the day after his girlfriend vanished? When asked about this, David explained that he had woken up feeling ill, probably from stress because he had been worried when Jennifer didn't return his call the previous night. He said he had spent the day at home and had learned about Jennifer's disappearance when Patricia Hayes called him around noon. But there was something about David's explanation that didn't sit right with investigators. He was almost too calm when discussing Jennifer's disappearance, his emotions seeming measured rather than genuine. Those who knew him said he hadn't shown the kind of desperate concern that would be expected from someone whose girlfriend had vanished. He hadn't joined the search parties. He hadn't attended the prayer vigils. When asked why, David said he felt helpless and didn't know what he could do to help. It was a reasonable answer, but something about his detachment raised red flags. By late January, David Thornton had become the primary person of interest in Jennifer's disappearance, though investigators lacked any concrete evidence linking him to a crime. They obtained a search warrant for his apartment and vehicle on January 26, conducting a thorough examination that lasted 7 hours. Crime scene technicians used luminol to test for blood traces, finding nothing. They vacuumed his truck for hair and fiber evidence, finding samples that would later be compared against Jennifer's DNA. They examined his cell phone records, his financial records, his employment timesheets. They interviewed his family members and former girlfriends, asking about his temperament and past relationships. What emerged was a portrait of a man who was outwardly normal, but perhaps harbored a deeper intensity than he showed to the world. An ex-girlfriend from 5 years earlier, Melissa Grant, told deputies that David had been difficult to break up with, calling her repeatedly and showing up at her workplace unannounced. She described him as not threatening exactly, but persistent to the point of discomfort. She said he had eventually moved on, but only after she had made it clear in no uncertain terms that the relationship was over. Another former girlfriend, Tracy Millhouse, told a similar story, describing David as possessive and jealous, someone who wanted constant reassurance and became sullen when she spent time with her friends. But none of this proved David had harmed Jennifer. And without a body, without a confession, without any physical evidence linking him to the abandoned car on Old Mill Road, investigators couldn't build a case strong enough to charge him with a crime. Sheriff Cross held another press conference on February 3rd, this one more somber than the last. He announced that the investigation was ongoing, that David Thornton had been interviewed multiple times and remained cooperative, and that anyone with information about Jennifer's disappearance should come forward. He didn't name David publicly as a suspect, but reporters at the scene noted his careful wording when asked if anyone had been ruled out. The answer was no. As winter turned to spring, the intensive search operations began to scale back. Volunteers returned to their regular lives, and the coordination center at the high school gymnasium was dismantled. Patricia Hayes continued searching on her own, driving along forest roads and walking through the woods calling her daughter's name. But even her hope was beginning to erode under the weight of months without answers. Emma, now 5 years old, asked about her mother constantly, and Patricia struggled to find words that would be both truthful and comforting. She told Emma that Mommy had gone away for a while, that everyone was looking for her, and that they had to be brave and patient. The case files for Jennifer Hayes grew thicker as investigators continued following leads that inevitably led nowhere. Tips called into the sheriff's department ranged from credible to outlandish. Someone had seen a woman matching Jennifer's description at a truck stop in Montana. Someone else claimed to have received a message from Jennifer's spirit. Another caller insisted that Jennifer had run away to California to start a new life. Every lead was investigated and dismissed. By summer, the active investigation had essentially stalled. The case was still open, still assigned to Detective Linda Morrison, who had taken over the primary investigative role in March. But with no new evidence and no new witnesses, there was little more to do than wait and hope. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves that they believed Jennifer was gone, that she had likely been harmed on the night she disappeared, and that her body was somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding Clearwater. They believed David Thornton knew more than he was saying, but they couldn't prove it. David himself had become something of a pariah in town, with people crossing the street to avoid him and former friends refusing to acknowledge his greetings. He continued working at the lumber mill, but the whispers followed him there too. He hadn't been charged with anything, hadn't been publicly accused, but in a small town where everyone knew everyone, suspicion was almost as damaging as conviction. Part 3. The silence 18 months after Jennifer Hayes disappeared. In June of 2002, Patricia Hayes made the difficult decision to leave Clearwater. The town that had been her home for 53 years had become a place of unbearable grief, where every street corner and familiar face reminded her of her missing daughter. She packed her belongings and Emma's toys into a U-Haul trailer and drove west to Coeur d'Alene, a larger city where she could find work and where Emma could start school without the burden of being known as the girl whose mother vanished. The move was both a practical necessity and an emotional retreat. Patricia had exhausted her savings during the months spent searching for Jennifer, taking unpaid leave from her job at the county clerk's office, and eventually resigning when it became clear she couldn't focus on work. The small life insurance policy she had kept for emergencies had been drained. Friends and family had helped with expenses, but Patricia knew she couldn't rely on charity indefinitely. In Coeur d'Alene, she found a job as a receptionist at a dental office and rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex where neighbors minded their own business and asked no questions about her past. Emma adjusted to the move with the resilience of childhood, but carried invisible wounds that manifested in troubling ways. She had nightmares several times a week, waking up screaming for her mother and taking hours to calm down. She drew pictures in school that concerned her teachers, dark scribbles and images of a woman lying down with her eyes closed. When a school counselor gently asked Emma about the drawings, the child said simply that she was drawing her mommy sleeping. The counselor made notes in Emma's file and recommended therapy, which Patricia couldn't afford. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have lived with the gnawing uncertainty of not knowing truth from lies, the weight of suspicion becomes its own kind of prison. Patricia thought about David Thornton constantly. She replayed every interaction she had witnessed between David and Jennifer, searching her memory for signs she might have missed, warnings she should have heeded. She remembered meeting David for the first time in November of 2000, how he had shaken her hand firmly and smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. She remembered thinking that Jennifer deserved someone stable, someone kind. Had she been wrong about him? Had her daughter's friendly boyfriend actually been a danger hidden in plain sight? The question haunted Patricia in quiet moments, when Emma was asleep and the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. She kept newspaper clippings about Jennifer's case in a shoebox under her bed, articles with headlines that screamed the mystery and offered no answers. Local woman vanishes without trace. Search for missing waitress continues. Family holds out hope after 6 months. She read them over and over, studying the photographs of Jennifer smiling, trying to reconcile the vibrant young woman in the pictures with the terrible possibility that she was gone forever. Back in Clearwater, life continued with its own complicated rhythms. David Thornton still worked at the lumber mill, though he had been passed over for a promotion he had expected, and several coworkers had requested transfers to different shifts to avoid working alongside him. He lived alone in his apartment, rarely venturing out except for work and necessary errands. He had gained weight and developed a habit of drinking beer on his porch in the evenings, staring out at nothing while neighbors walked past without greeting him. He had never been charged with any crime related to Jennifer's disappearance, had never been officially named a suspect, but the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict long ago. In the sheriff's department, the file on Jennifer Hayes gathered dust in a cabinet reserved for cold cases. Detective Linda Morrison checked in on the case periodically, reviewing the evidence files and hoping for a break that never came. She had conducted over 100 interviews, followed dozens of leads, spent countless hours reconstructing Jennifer's final day. But without a body, without a confession, without some piece of physical evidence that could definitively link David or anyone else to Jennifer's disappearance, the case remained frustratingly unsolved. Detective Morrison never closed the file, though. She kept her business card taped to the inside cover with a note written in her careful handwriting. Someone knows what happened. Someone will talk eventually. Years passed. Emma started first grade, then second, then third. She was a quiet child who loved reading and drawing, who made friends slowly but deeply. She asked about her mother less frequently as time went on, not because she forgot, but because she learned that asking brought sadness to her grandmother's eyes. Patricia told Emma stories about Jennifer, about how kind she had been, how hard she had worked, how much she had loved her daughter. But Patricia always stopped short of sharing her suspicions about David Thornton. What good would it do to plant seeds of hatred in a child's heart? What comfort would it bring to name a man who had never been proven guilty of anything? In 2008, when Emma was 12 years old, something shifted in the case that had remained frozen for so long. Patricia received a phone call from Detective Morrison, who was now a sergeant in the sheriff's department. New forensic technology had advanced to the point where evidence that had been inconclusive in 2000 could now be retested with greater accuracy. Hair samples collected from David Thornton's truck were being sent to a lab in Seattle for advanced DNA analysis. Fibers from Jennifer's jacket were being examined, using techniques that hadn't existed 8 years earlier. There was no guarantee the tests would reveal anything significant, but it was the first development in the case in years, and it rekindled a flame of hope that Patricia had thought extinguished. The results came back in September 2008. The hair samples were confirmed to be Jennifer's, but this was not particularly damning, since David and Jennifer had been in a relationship, and Jennifer could have been in his truck many times before her disappearance. The fiber evidence was similarly inconclusive, but the lab had found something else, something that had been missed in the initial investigation. A small blood stain on the underside of the truck's bench seat, hidden in a seam where the fabric met the metal frame. The stain had been too small to detect with the technology available in 2001, but modern testing confirmed it was blood, and DNA analysis confirmed it was Jennifer's. This discovery changed everything. Detective Morrison, now working alongside a new generation of investigators, obtained a warrant to re-interview David Thornton in October 2008. David, now 36 years old, heavier and grayer than he had been 8 years earlier, sat in the same interview room where he had been questioned multiple times before. This time, though, the atmosphere was different. Detective Morrison placed photographs of the truck's interior on the table, along with lab reports highlighting the bloodstain. She asked David how Jennifer's blood had gotten into his truck. David's reaction was telling. He didn't express shock or confusion. He didn't immediately offer an innocent explanation. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and remained silent for nearly 2 minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. He said he didn't know how blood got there. He said Jennifer had been in his truck many times, that maybe she had cut herself on something. But Detective Morrison pressed harder. She pointed out the location of the stain, hidden beneath the seat where it would only be present if blood had pooled or been wiped there deliberately. She asked David to explain this to help her understand. David asked for a lawyer. The interview ended. Part 4. The revelation for 16 more years. The case against David Thornton remained in a state of frustrating limbo. The blood evidence was significant but not conclusive enough on its own to bring charges for something as serious as homicide without a body. Prosecutors argued that a defense attorney would claim the blood could have come from an innocent injury, that its presence in David's truck, while suspicious, didn't prove Jennifer had been harmed there. They needed more. They needed Jennifer's body or a confession or a witness who could testify to what David had done. But time, as it often does, changed circumstances in unexpected ways. Emma Hayes grew up carrying the weight of her mother's disappearance like an invisible burden. She graduated from high school in 2014, attended community college studying psychology, and began working with at-risk youth. She never stopped thinking about her mother, never stopped wondering what had happened that December night. And in the summer of 2024, at the age of 28, Emma decided she needed answers more than she needed to protect herself from the truth. Emma reached out to Detective Morrison, who had retired from the sheriff's department in 2020, but had remained available as a consultant on the case. Emma explained that she had been thinking about her mother's case constantly, reviewing everything she knew, everything she had been told over the years. She said she had memories from when she was 4 years old, fragments of recollections that she had dismissed as dreams but now wondered if they might be real. Detective Morrison listened carefully and arranged for Emma to speak with a forensic psychologist who specialized in childhood memory recovery. Over several months of careful, ethical therapy sessions that avoided any suggestion or leading questions, Emma began to access memories that had been buried for nearly 25 years. She remembered her mother talking on the phone the night she disappeared, remembered hearing her mother's voice saying a name, David. She remembered being at her grandmother's house and hearing adults talking in worried whispers. And she remembered something else, something that made her blood run cold when the memory finally surfaced clearly. She remembered being at David's apartment once with her mother, remembered David raising his voice, remembered her mother taking her hand and leaving quickly. This wasn't enough to build a case, but it spurred renewed investigative efforts. Detective Morrison came out of retirement unofficially, working with current investigators to review every piece of evidence again. They re-interviewed witnesses, some of whom had new recollections or were willing to share information they had previously withheld. One former coworker from the lumber mill, Jason Hendricks, revealed that David had come to work on December 15, 2000, despite officially calling in sick. Jason had seen David's truck in the parking lot early that morning, around 6 o'clock, before the shift started. He had thought it odd at the time, but hadn't mentioned it to investigators because he hadn't wanted to get involved. Now, 24 years later, he felt guilty about his silence and was willing to make a formal statement. This information was crucial. If David had been at the lumber mill at 6 in the morning on December 15th, he had lied about being home sick all day. What had he been doing at the mill hours before his shift would normally start? Investigators examined records and discovered that the lumber mill had a large industrial incinerator used for burning wood waste and other debris. The incinerator was typically operated during business hours, but could be accessed by employees with keys, including foremen like David. The terrible implication was clear.